The sound of knuckles against wood cut through the howling wind like a gunshot. So urgent and desperate that Fletcher Crawford nearly dropped the poker he'd been using to stoke the fire in his small cabin outside Abiquiu, New Mexico territory. It was January of 1878, and the blizzard that had descended upon the high desert landscape 3 hours earlier showed no signs of mercy. Fletcher had weathered plenty of storms in his 26 years, the last 4 of which he'd spent working cattle on the vast ranches that sprawled across this unforgiving territory. But this one carried a particular ferocity that made even his bones ache with cold despite the roaring fire. The knocking came again, more frantic this time, accompanied by a voice so faint he might have imagined it if not for the sheer terror it carried. He crossed the room in 4 long strides, his boots heavy against the worn wooden planks, and threw open the door to find a figure collapsed against the frame. Snow had transformed the person into something barely recognizable as human, just a trembling mass of ice-crusted fabric and frozen limbs. Fletcher didn't hesitate. He hauled the stranger inside with arms made strong from years of ranch work, kicking the door shut against the wind that tried to follow them in like a hungry wolf. "Jesus," he muttered, lowering the person carefully onto the braided rug near the fireplace. It was only then, as he brushed away the snow and ice from the figure's face, that he realized his unexpected visitor was a woman. A young woman, probably not much older than 20, with lips turned blue and skin so pale it looked translucent in the firelight. Her dark hair hung in frozen strands around her face, and her clothes, while clearly meant for travel, were wholly inadequate for the storm that raged outside. Fletcher's hands moved with practiced efficiency born from years of dealing with injured cattle and horses in harsh conditions. He knew hypothermia when he saw it. Her breathing came shallow and irregular. Her body had stopped shivering, which meant she was in the dangerous stages of freezing, and her eyes remained closed even as he called out to her. "Can you hear me?" His voice was rough from disuse. He lived alone out here, had chosen this isolation deliberately after the war had taken too much from him, and sometimes days passed without him speaking to another soul. "I need you to stay with me now. Can you open your eyes?" There was no response. Fletcher cursed under his breath and began removing her wet outer layers with the careful respect of a man who understood both propriety and survival. The coat came off first, so stiff with ice it could have stood on its own. Then her gloves, revealing fingers that looked waxy and wrong. He'd seen frostbite before too, and the sight made his gut clench with worry. He grabbed every blanket he owned from his narrow bed in the corner and wrapped them around her, then positioned her as close to the fire as he dared without risking burns. The cabin was small, just 1 room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and his few possessions, but it was solid and warm, and right now that was all that mattered. "Come on now," Fletcher said, chafing her hands between his own, trying to restore circulation. "You didn't knock on my door just to die on my floor. That would be poor manners, and something tells me you were raised better than that." He kept up a steady stream of words, nonsense mostly, while he worked. He'd learned during the war that sometimes the sound of a human voice could pull someone back from the edge when nothing else would. He heated water on the stove and carefully spooned small amounts between her blue lips, relieved when her throat worked to swallow. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The storm continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside, the woman's color slowly began to improve. Her breathing deepened and evened out. When she finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of dark honey in firelight, Fletcher felt relief wash over him so intensely it surprised him. "Where?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked and dry. My cabin about 3 miles outside Abiquiu, Fletcher said, sitting back on his heels to give her space. You knocked during the storm. Do you remember? She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her, muscles still too cold and exhausted to cooperate. Fletcher steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, keeping his touch light and respectful. Easy now. You nearly froze to death. Your body needs time. My horse, she managed, and he could hear the panic creeping into her voice. I had a horse. She threw me when lightning struck near us. I tried to find her, but the storm. I couldn't see anything, and I just kept walking, and then I saw your light. Your horse is likely hunkered down somewhere waiting out the storm, same as we are, Fletcher said, though he knew the odds weren't good. Animals could survive what humans couldn't sometimes, but a panicked horse in a blizzard faced long odds. Nothing to be done about it until this weather breaks. Right now, you need to focus on warming up. Can you tell me your name? She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched wariness war with necessity in her expression. She was a stranger in a strange man's cabin, alone and vulnerable, and he could see her calculating the risks even through her exhaustion. Lillian, she finally said. Lillian Nash. I'm trying to reach Abiquiu. I have family there, an aunt. Fletcher Crawford, he replied, then added, You're safe here. I give you my word on that. Something in his tone must have convinced her because the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Thank you for opening your door. I thought I was going to die out there. That makes two of us who thought that, Fletcher said with a grim smile. He stood and moved to the stove where he had a pot of stew he'd made the day before. You need to eat something. Your body needs fuel to warm itself up. While he ladled stew into a bowl, he felt her eyes on him, assessing. He wondered what she saw. He knew he wasn't much to look at after years of hard living. His face weathered beyond his years. A scar cutting through his left eyebrow courtesy of a Confederate bayonet. His dark blonde hair too long because he couldn't be bothered to ride into town for a trim. He was tall and lean, built for endurance rather than show, and his clothes were clean but worn from use. How long have you lived out here alone? Lillian asked as he brought her the bowl, helping her hold it steady when her hands shook too badly to manage. 4 years, give or take, Fletcher said. I work for the Rodriguez Ranch managing their northern pastures. They let me have this cabin in exchange for keeping watch over the stock up this way. That's a lonely life. It suits me. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, which he appreciated. They fell into silence while she ate, slowly at first and then with more appetite as her body woke up to its hunger. Fletcher busied himself checking the fire, making sure the wind wasn't getting in through any gaps in the walls, anything to give her privacy to recover her strength. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Snow piled against the windows until Fletcher could barely see out, and the wind made sounds like dying animals. He'd lived through enough territory winters to know this one would keep them trapped here for at least a day, maybe more depending on how much snow fell and whether the temperature stayed this bitter. I'm sorry for the imposition, Lillian said eventually, handing back the empty bowl. I know this isn't how you plan to spend your evening. Can't say I've ever minded saving a life, Fletcher replied. Though I'll admit it's been a while since I've had company, my conversation skills might be rusty. You've done fine so far. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself. Better than fine. You saved my life. Fletcher felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not from someone looking at him the way Lillian was, like he was something more than just a solitary cowboy living out in the middle of nowhere. Just did what anyone would do, he muttered. No, Lillian said firmly. Not anyone. Some men would have taken advantage, some wouldn't have opened the door at all. You did both the right thing and the kind thing, and there's a difference. Before Fletcher could respond to that, a particularly vicious gust of wind hit the cabin hard enough to make the walls shudder. Lillian flinched, and he saw fear flash across her face. "Cabin's solid," he assured her. "Built it myself with timber from the mountains. It's weathered worse than this." "You built this?" "The original structure was here, but it was barely standing. Spent my first winter here making it livable." He glanced around at his handiwork with a critical eye. "It's not much, but it keeps the weather out." "It's wonderful," Lillian said, and she sounded like she meant it. "It has character. And right now, it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen because it's warm and safe." Fletcher found himself studying her more openly now that she was awake and alert. Even exhausted and disheveled, Lillian Nash was striking. She had strong features, a determined set to her jaw, and those remarkable honey-colored eyes that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. Her dark hair was beginning to dry in waves around her face, and there was an intelligence in her expression that suggested a quick mind and a quicker tongue. "Tell me about your aunt in Abiquiu," Fletcher said, settling into one of his chairs. "She expecting you?" Lillian's expression clouded. "No, I'm hoping to surprise her. We haven't seen each other in years, since before my parents died." "She's my mother's sister, married a merchant and moved out here about 15 years ago. I'm coming from Missouri, from Independence. There's nothing left for me there anymore." Fletcher heard the weight of story behind those words but didn't pry. Everyone who came west was running from something or towards something, and usually it was both at once. He understood that better than most. "What's your aunt's name? I might know her. It's a small town." "Margaret Navarro. Her husband is Diego Navarro. They run a general store." "I know them," Fletcher said, nodding. "Good people. Your aunt is sharp as a tack and doesn't suffer fools. Your uncle makes the best leather goods in 3 territories. They'll be glad to see you, I expect." Relief washed over Lillian's face. "They're still there, then. Still together and well." "Last I saw them, about a week ago when I went in for supplies. They were asking after their niece back east, actually. Seems they'd sent a letter inviting you to come stay with them." "I got the letter," Lillian said softly. "It's what decided me. After my parents passed last year, I tried to make it work, staying in their house, keeping their shop open, but I couldn't. Too many memories, too many ghosts. And then people started thinking I needed a man to take care of me, started pushing matches that would have made me miserable. So when Aunt Margaret's letter came saying I had a place here if I wanted it, it felt like providence." "Long journey for a woman alone," Fletcher observed carefully, trying to keep judgment out of his voice. Lillian's eyes flashed. "I made it, didn't I? Well, almost. Except for the blizzard and losing my horse. But I traveled with a wagon train until Santa Fe, and I've been perfectly fine on my own since then. I'm not some delicate flower who needs constant tending." Fletcher held up his hands in mock surrender, fighting a smile. "Didn't mean to imply you were. Anyone who makes it this far on their own has my respect, regardless of whether they're wearing pants or a dress." She studied him for a moment, then relaxed. "Sorry. I've had to defend my choices to so many people over the past few months that I suppose I'm expecting criticism even when it's not being given. No apology needed. And for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. This territory has opportunities for people willing to work hard and think for themselves. Your aunt and uncle have done well for themselves. I imagine they'll be able to help you get established. That's my hope." Lillian stifled a yawn, her body clearly still recovering from its ordeal. "Though right now I'd settle for just making it there alive." "You will," Fletcher said with more confidence than he felt. The storm outside was still howling, and he knew from experience that winter in the New Mexico territory could be deadly even for those who thought themselves prepared. "Once this weather clears, I'll ride into town with you, make sure you get there safe." You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, I want to. Besides, I should check in with your aunt and uncle, let them know what happened. They'll want to know their niece ran into trouble but came through it all right. Lillian looked like she wanted to argue, but another yawn overtook her. Fletcher stood and moved toward his bed in the corner. You take the bed, he said, already pulling off the remaining blankets. I'll make up a spot by the fire. Absolutely not, Lillian protested. You've already saved my life and given me shelter. I'm not taking your bed too. You're still recovering from hypothermia and you need proper rest. I've slept in worse places than a warm floor. Don't make me pull rank as the resident host. They stared at each other for a moment, wills clashing, and Fletcher had to suppress another smile. Lillian Nash was stubborn, that much was clear, and under different circumstances he might have found that frustrating. Instead, he found it oddly charming. Fine, she finally conceded. But only because I don't think I could make it across the room right now without falling over. Fletcher helped her up, steadying her when her legs proved uncertain, and guided her to the bed. She sank onto it with a sigh of relief, and he pulled the blankets up over her, trying not to notice how small she looked in his bed or how right it seemed to have her there. Thank you, Fletcher, she said softly, her eyes already drifting closed. For everything. Sleep well, Lillian. He returned to the fire and made himself as comfortable as possible on the floor with the remaining blankets. It wasn't the worst place he'd spent a night by far. The war had taught him to sleep anywhere under any conditions, and at least here he was warm and dry with a roof over his head. The storm continued through the night, but inside the cabin all was peaceful. Fletcher found himself lying awake longer than usual, hyper-aware of Lillian's presence, the soft sound of her breathing, the rustle of blankets when she shifted in sleep. He told himself it was just the strangeness of having another person in his space after so long alone, but he knew it was more than that. There was something about her, something that had struck him the moment he'd seen her face in the firelight. A strength, a determination, a spark that called to something in him he'd thought long dead. He'd spent 4 years in self-imposed isolation, telling himself he preferred it this way, that he was better off alone after everything he'd seen and done in the war. But now, listening to Lillian sleep in his bed, Fletcher felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought he'd never feel again. Hope. When morning came, the storm had not abated. If anything, it seemed to have grown stronger overnight. Fletcher woke to find snow had drifted halfway up the windows, and the wind was still howling like a tormented spirit. He fed the fire, careful to be quiet so as not to wake Lillian, and assess their supplies. He had enough food for a week if they were careful, plenty of firewood stacked against the back wall, and water from the pump just outside the door, though getting to it would be a challenge. He was frying salt pork and beans for breakfast when Lillian stirred. She sat up slowly, pushing her hair back from her face, and looked around the cabin with the confusion of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. When her eyes found him, recognition dawned along with something else he couldn't quite name. "Morning," Fletcher said. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Lillian admitted, rubbing her arms, "and my fingers hurt. But alive, which is better than the alternative. How long did I sleep?" "About 12 hours, give or take. Your body needed it. The storm's still going strong, I'm afraid. We're stuck here for at least another day, maybe more." Lillian moved to the window, peering out at the wall of white beyond the glass. "I've never seen snow like this. We got winter storms in Missouri, but nothing like this." "High desert winters can be harsh," Fletcher said, dividing the food between 2 plates. "The elevation plays tricks on people. Come eat. You need to keep your strength up." They sat at the small table, and Fletcher was struck by how domestic it felt, sharing a meal with someone in the morning light. He'd forgotten this, the simple pleasure of company, of conversation over breakfast. "Tell me about yourself," Lillian said between bites. "You know my story, or at least the broad strokes. What's yours?" Fletcher hesitated, old instincts screaming at him to deflect, to keep his walls up, to protect himself from the vulnerability of being known. But something about the way Lillian looked at him, open and genuinely interested, made him want to try. "Not much to tell," he started, then caught her skeptical expression and sighed. "All right. I'm from Texas originally, grew up on a ranch near Austin. Signed up to fight when the war started, thought it was the right thing to do. Spent 4 years learning exactly how wrong I was about just about everything." "Which side?" Lillian asked quietly. "Confederacy." Fletcher met her eyes steadily, waiting for judgment. "I was young and stupid and believed what I was told. By the time I understood what we were really fighting for, I was in too deep to get out. I've had to live with that." "But you survived. Physically." Fletcher pushed his food around his plate. "Came out here after it ended because I couldn't stay in Texas. Too many memories, too many people I'd failed. Figured the territory was far enough away that maybe I could start over, become someone different." "And have you become someone different?" Fletcher considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I'm trying. Working honest labor, staying out of trouble, not hurting anyone. It's not much of a redemption, but it's what I've got." Lillian reached across the table and touched his hand just briefly, but the contact sent warmth through him. "I think you're being too hard on yourself. The war damaged a lot of people on both sides. The fact that you recognize what you were a part of, that you're trying to do better now, that matters." "Does it?" "Yes." Her voice was firm, certain. "Intent matters. Growth matters. You're not the same person you were then, Fletcher. I can see that, and I've only known you a few hours." Fletcher found himself wanting desperately to believe her, to accept the absolution she seemed willing to offer. He'd spent so long punishing himself, exiling himself to this isolated existence, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than his worst mistakes. "Thank you," he said finally. "That means more than you know." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and then Fletcher set about the business of keeping them alive and comfortable. He showed Lillian where everything was stored, explained how to work the stove, taught her the peculiarities of the pump outside when they bundled up to fetch water. The storm made even that simple task an ordeal, the wind trying to tear them off their feet, snow stinging their exposed skin like needles. Back inside, they shook off the snow and stood by the fire, and Lillian started to laugh. It began as a small chuckle but grew until she was doubled over, tears streaming down her face. Fletcher stared at her in confusion until she managed to gasp out, "We nearly died just getting water. This is insane." The absurdity of it hit him then, and Fletcher found himself laughing too, really laughing for the first time in years. It felt good, cathartic, like lancing a wound and letting poison drain away. "Welcome to winter in the territory," he managed when he could speak again. "It's not for the faint of heart. Clearly I have much to learn," Lillian said, wiping her eyes. "Good thing I've got an excellent teacher." Something in the way she said it, in the way she looked at him, made Fletcher's heart skip. He was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were standing, how the exertion of fighting the storm had brought color to her cheeks, how her wet hair curled around her face. He wanted to reach out and tuck one of those curls behind her ear, wanted to close the distance between them and discover if her lips were as soft as they looked. Instead, he stepped back, reminding himself that Lillian was under his protection, that she'd nearly died less than a day ago, that she deserved better than him acting on attraction when she was vulnerable and dependent on him for survival. "I should check the firewood supply," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Make sure we have enough to get through another night. If Lillian noticed his abrupt withdrawal, she didn't comment on it. She simply nodded and moved to warm herself by the fire while Fletcher threw himself into mundane tasks, trying to ignore the way his cabin suddenly felt too small with both of them in it. The day passed slowly. The storm continued its assault, and they were truly trapped, forced into an intimacy neither had planned for. They talked, sharing stories about their lives before, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. Fletcher found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with anyone since before the war, and Lillian matched him story for story, revelation for revelation. He learned that she'd helped her parents run a bookshop in Independence, that she loved to read more than almost anything, that she had strong opinions about everything from politics to poetry. She was funny and sharp and opinionated, and Fletcher found himself captivated by every word she spoke. Lillian learned about his childhood on the ranch, about how he'd loved working with horses, about the little sister he'd lost to fever when he was 12, and how it had broken his mother's heart. She learned about the friends he'd made and lost in the war, about the things he'd seen that still woke him in the night sometimes. As evening approached and Fletcher prepared their supper, Lillian said something that stopped him in his tracks. "I like you, Fletcher Crawford." He turned to find her watching him from her seat at the table, her expression serious. "I like you too," he said carefully. "No, I mean I really like you. I know it's fast, I know we just met, I know this is probably the worst timing in the world, but I believe in being honest about these things. You're a good man, I can see that, and I feel something when I look at you, something I've never felt before." Fletcher's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Lillian, you don't know me. Not really. A day doesn't make for knowing someone." "Maybe not in the normal course of things," she agreed. "But we're not in the normal course of things, are we? We're trapped in a cabin in a blizzard, forced to be nothing but honest with each other because there's nowhere to hide, nothing to do but talk and be ourselves. I've learned more about you in these past hours than I knew about men I'd courted for months back home." Courted, the word came out sharper than Fletcher intended, and he saw Lillian's lips quirk in amusement. A few men tried. None of them stuck. They wanted someone soft and biddable, someone who would smile and nod and never have an opinion of her own. "That's not me. It will never be me." "Good," Fletcher said fervently. "The world has enough soft and biddable people. It needs more like you." "So you do feel it too," Lillian said softly. "This pull between us." Fletcher wanted to deny it, wanted to protect himself and her from the inevitable complication and potential heartbreak, but he'd told her he believed in honesty, and she deserved that from him now. "Yes," he admitted, "I feel it, but Lillian, I'm not a good bet. I'm a ranch hand living in a one-room cabin in the middle of nowhere. I've got more ghosts than prospects, more regrets than hopes. You deserve better than that. You deserve better than me. Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve?" Lillian stood and crossed to him, closing the distance he tried to maintain. "I'm not some child who needs protecting from her own choices, Fletcher. I'm a grown woman who knows her own mind, and my mind is telling me that you're worth taking a chance on. Your mind might be wrong." "It might be," she agreed, "but I don't think so. Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" Fletcher wasn't sure he did, but he found himself nodding anyway. "I see a man who opens his door in a blizzard to help a stranger. I see a man who lives by a code of honor even when no one's watching. I see someone who's been broken and is trying to put himself back together, and I think that takes more courage than never being broken in the first place. I see someone I could love, Fletcher, if you'd let me." The words hit Fletcher like a physical blow. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself he preferred it, that he deserved it. But here was Lillian Nash, offering him something he'd stopped believing he could have: connection, understanding, maybe even love. "I don't know how to do this," he said honestly. "It's been so long since I let anyone close. I don't know if I remember how." "We'll figure it out together," Lillian said. And then she did what he'd been wanting to do since the morning, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his scarred skin. "If you want to. No pressure, no expectations. Just the possibility of something good." Fletcher closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, feeling something inside him that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. When he opened his eyes again, Lillian was smiling at him with such warmth and hope that it made his chest ache. "I want to," he said. "God help me, I want to try." Lillian's smile widened, and then she was stretching up on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a declaration. Fletcher stood frozen for a heartbeat, overwhelmed, and then he was kissing her back, his arms coming up to wrap around her waist, pulling her close. It was like coming home after years lost in the wilderness. Fletcher had kissed women before, had thought he understood what desire felt like, but nothing in his experience compared to the feeling of Lillian in his arms, her lips moving against his, her hands tangling in his hair. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "That was—" "I know," Lillian said, her voice full of wonder. "I know." They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and outside the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, all was warmth and light, and the tentative beginning of something that felt like it might be love. The storm finally broke 2 days later. Fletcher woke to silence, the absence of howling wind so profound it seemed loud in its own way. He rose carefully, trying not to wake Lillian, who was curled up in his bed, and moved to the window. The world outside had been transformed into a wonderland of white, snow piled in drifts as high as his shoulders in places, the landscape unrecognizable under its frozen blanket. It was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The sun was out, brilliant against all that white, but Fletcher knew the cold would be bone deep. Still, the weather had cleared enough that travel was possible, if difficult. He could get Lillian to her aunt and uncle in Abiquiu today if they started early. The thought should have brought relief, but instead Fletcher felt something twist in his chest. Once Lillian was safely delivered to her family, he'd have no reason to see her again. She'd start her new life in town, and he'd return to his isolated existence on the ranch. The past 3 days in the cabin would become just a memory, a strange interlude brought about by circumstance and proximity, unless he did something about it. "You're thinking too loud," Lillian's sleepy voice came from the bed. "I can hear your thoughts from over here." Fletcher turned to find her sitting up, blankets pooled around her waist, her hair a wild tangle and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She'd never looked more beautiful. "Storm's past," he said. "We can head into town today." Something flickered across Lillian's face, there and gone too quickly for Fletcher to identify. "That's good news." "Is it? Isn't it?" She climbed out of bed and came to stand beside him at the window, both of them looking out at the transformed world. "This is what I've been traveling toward for months. My fresh start, my new life. Of course it's good news." "But," Lillian sighed, and when she spoke her voice was small, "but I've been happy here. These past days with you, trapped in this tiny cabin, they've been some of the best of my life. And I know that's probably just the circumstances talking, the intensity of the situation making everything feel bigger and more important than it is, but Fletcher, when I think about leaving here, about leaving you, it hurts." Fletcher felt relief so intense it made him dizzy. "It's not just the circumstances, at least not for me. I've been alone out here for years, perfectly content with my own company. But these last days with you, I've remembered what it feels like to be alive, to want things, to hope. And the thought of going back to how it was before, it's unbearable. "What are we going to do?" Lillian asked, turning to look up at him. "I don't know," Fletcher admitted. "You need to get to your family. They're expecting you, or they will be once they know you're here. And you deserve a chance to start your new life in town, to see what opportunities exist for you there. I can't ask you to give that up." "You're not asking. I'm the one who would be choosing." "Lillian, you can't make a decision like that based on 3 days in a cabin. That wouldn't be fair to either of us." She looked like she wanted to argue, but finally she nodded. "You're right. I know you're right. But Fletcher, I need you to promise me something." "What? Don't disappear on me." "Once we get to town, once I'm with my aunt and uncle, don't use that as an excuse to ride out of my life. Give us a chance to figure out what this is in the real world, not just in this cabin. Can you promise me that?" Fletcher pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I promise." "I'm not going anywhere, Lillian. You're stuck with me now, whether you like it or not." "I like it," she said against his chest. "I like it very much." They prepared to leave with a mixture of anticipation and reluctance. Fletcher saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Red, and fashioned a way for Lillian to ride behind him. He packed supplies for the journey, though it was only a few hours' ride in good conditions. With the snow, it might take twice that or more. Before they left, Fletcher took one last look around his cabin. It looked the same as it always had, but somehow it felt different now. Lillian had changed it simply by being here, had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The isolation he'd thought he wanted suddenly felt like loneliness, and he knew he'd never be able to come back here without thinking of these past days, without remembering how it felt to have her in his space, filling it with laughter and warmth and possibility. The ride to Abiquiu was slow and difficult. Red was sure-footed, but even he struggled in places where the snow had drifted deep. Fletcher guided them carefully, always alert for dangers hidden beneath the white blanket. Lillian held tight to his waist, her body pressed against his back, and Fletcher found comfort in her presence even as they fought the elements. They talked as they rode, their voices carrying across the silent landscape. Fletcher pointed out landmarks, told her about the area, the people who lived in the scattered ranches and homesteads, the history of the region. Lillian asked questions about everything, her curiosity insatiable, and Fletcher found himself seeing the territory through new eyes as he tried to describe it to her. "It's beautiful," Lillian said at one point, looking out at the snow-covered mountains rising in the distance. "Harsh, but beautiful. I can see why you've stayed." "It grows on you," Fletcher agreed. "At first it seems like nothing but rock and dust and empty space, but then you start to see the details. The way the light changes through the day, turning the cliffs a dozen different colors. The hidden springs and valleys where green things grow. The sky at night, so full of stars you feel like you could reach up and touch them. It gets into your blood, this place. It becomes part of you." "I hope it becomes part of me too," Lillian said softly. They reached the outskirts of Abiquiu around midday. The town was small, maybe 300 souls, built around a plaza in the old Spanish style. The buildings were adobe, most of them, their flat roofs covered in snow, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear, cold air. People were out digging paths through the snow, and Fletcher could hear the sound of voices and laughter carrying on the wind. He guided Red through the streets toward the general store, and as they rode, he was hyper-aware of the looks they were getting. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone else's business, and Fletcher showing up with a strange woman riding behind him would be the talk of the town by nightfall. The Navarro General Store sat on the north side of the plaza, a solid adobe building with a wooden sign hanging above the door. Fletcher helped Lillian down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist perhaps longer than strictly necessary. She looked up at him, and he could see nervousness in her eyes. What if they're not happy to see me? What if the invitation was just politeness? From what I know of your aunt, she doesn't do anything out of politeness if she doesn't mean it, Fletcher assured her. Your family, Lillian. They'll welcome you. Before Lillian could respond, the store door burst open and a woman emerged, her dark eyes going wide with shock. Lillian. Lillian, is that really you? Aunt Margaret, Lillian breathed. And then she was running, or trying to run through the snow, and her aunt was doing the same, and they met in the middle in a collision of hugs and tears and laughter. Fletcher stayed back, holding Red's reins, watching the reunion with a smile. Margaret Navarro was a small, compact woman in her mid-40s with iron-gray hair and a face that spoke of both strength and warmth. She held Lillian at arm's length, looking her over with a critical eye, and then pulled her close again. We've been so worried, Margaret was saying. Your letter said you'd arrive weeks ago. We thought something terrible must have happened. Diego has been riding out to meet every stage, every wagon train. Where have you been? I got caught in the storm, Lillian explained. I lost my horse and would have frozen to death if Fletcher hadn't found me. He saved my life, Aunt Margaret. He took me in and kept me safe until the weather cleared. Margaret turned her sharp gaze on Fletcher, and he felt himself being assessed and measured. After a long moment, she nodded as if satisfied with what she saw. Fletcher Crawford, she said, coming over to him. My husband and I were just talking about you the other day, wondering how you were managing with the storm. Looks like you managed just fine. And you saved my niece's life to boot. I'm in your debt, young man. No debt, Fletcher said, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Just did what anyone would. Not anyone, Margaret said, echoing Lillian's words from days before. But we can discuss that later. Right now, we need to get Lillian inside and warm. You'll come in too, Fletcher. Have something hot to drink at least before you head back out. It wasn't really a question, and Fletcher knew better than to argue with Margaret Navarro. He tied Red to the hitching post and followed the women inside, stomping snow from his boots. The store was warm and crowded with goods, everything from dry goods to tools to bolts of fabric. A man stood behind the counter, tall and lean with gray streaked hair and kind eyes. This had to be Diego Navarro. When he saw Lillian, his face transformed with joy. Our girl, he said, coming around the counter with surprising speed. You're finally here, gracias a Dios. More hugs, more tears, more explanations. Fletcher stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like an intruder on this family moment. But then Lillian reached back and pulled him forward, including him in the circle. This is Fletcher Crawford, she said. Fletcher, my Uncle Diego. And like I told Aunt Margaret, he saved my life. If he hadn't opened his door during the storm, if he hadn't taken care of me, I wouldn't be here. Diego shook Fletcher's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Then you have our eternal gratitude, Senor Crawford. Anything you need, anything at all, you come to us. I appreciate that, Fletcher said, but I was just in the right place at the right time. Nevertheless. Diego released his hand and turned back to Lillian. You must be exhausted. Come, we have a room prepared for you. We've had it ready for weeks, hoping you'd arrive. And you're too thin, we need to feed you. Margaret, start heating soup. I'll help Lillian with her things. He paused, looking at her more closely. Where are your things? Lost with my horse in the storm, Lillian said with a rueful smile. Everything I owned was in those saddlebags. Now I have literally nothing but the clothes on my back. We'll remedy that, Margaret said firmly. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you some proper things. But for today, you rest and recover. Fletcher, you'll stay for supper at least. It's the least we can do. Fletcher wanted to refuse, to give Lillian space to reconnect with her family without him hovering, but the hope in Lillian's eyes made him nod. I'd be honored. The afternoon passed in a blur of warmth and conversation. Margaret's soup was rich and flavorful, and they ate around a small table in the living quarters above the store. Diego and Margaret wanted to know everything about Lillian's journey, and she told them, leaving out nothing except the depth of what had developed between her and Fletcher. Fletcher added details here and there, describing the storm's ferocity, explaining how he'd treated her hypothermia. He watched Lillian interact with her aunt and uncle, saw how comfortable she was with them, how quickly they fell into easy rhythms of conversation and affection. This was where she belonged, with family in community, not isolated in his cabin on the edge of civilization. As evening approached, Fletcher knew he needed to leave. He had responsibilities at the ranch, animals to check on, work that couldn't wait. And he'd promised Lillian he wouldn't disappear, but he also needed to give her space to start her new life. I should head out, he said, standing. I want to make it back before dark. Of course, Diego said, also rising, but you'll come back to visit, yes. We'd like to thank you properly once we've had time to prepare something worthy of what you did. There's no need for that, Fletcher started, but Margaret cut him off with a wave of her hand. There's every need. But beyond that, we'd like you to visit because we like you, Fletcher Crawford. You seem like good people, and those are rare enough that we'd like to count you among our friends. Fletcher felt warmth spread through his chest. I'd like that too. Lillian walked him down to where Red waited, the two of them stepping out into the cold evening air. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, and their breath came out in clouds of frost. You're really going, Lillian said, and Fletcher heard the question underneath the words. I have to. But I meant what I said, Lillian. I'm not disappearing. I'll be back. Tomorrow if I can, the day after at the latest. We'll figure this out. Promise. I promise. Fletcher pulled her close, not caring if anyone saw. He'd spent too long hiding, too long keeping himself apart. If he was going to do this, to try for something real with Lillian, he needed to stop being afraid. These past days with you, they changed something in me. Opened something I thought was closed forever. I'm not walking away from that. From you. Lillian kissed him then, right there in the middle of town where anyone could see, and Fletcher kissed her back with all the feeling he couldn't put into words. When they broke apart, he saw tears on her cheeks. I'll be waiting, she said. Fletcher rode out of Abiquiu as the last light faded from the sky, and the whole way back to his cabin he felt like he'd left something essential behind. The isolation that had felt like safety for so long now felt like exactly what it was: loneliness, self-imposed exile. He'd thought he was protecting himself by staying apart, but really he'd just been preventing himself from living. That night, alone in his cabin, Fletcher lay in his bed and could smell Lillian's scent on the blankets, could feel her presence in every corner of the small space. He'd been here hundreds of nights before, but this was the first time it felt empty. He was up before dawn, unable to sleep, his mind full of plans. He did his morning chores quickly, then saddled Red and rode to the Rodriguez ranch house to speak with his employer. Carlos Rodriguez was a fair man, a good man, and he listened carefully as Fletcher explained about finding Lillian in the storm, about needing to spend more time in town for the next few weeks. You've been alone too long, Carlos said when Fletcher finished. I've thought so for years. This woman, she's special to you. Yes, Fletcher admitted. I know it's fast, I know it seems crazy, but yes, she's special, Carlos smiled. The best things in life often happen fast. My wife, I knew I would marry her 5 minutes after we met. 40 years we've been together now. If this woman makes you happy, Fletcher, if she brings you back to life, then you should pursue that. Take the time you need. will manage the cattle. I can't just abandon my responsibilities. You're not. You're taking a few weeks to court a woman. That's not abandonment, that's being human. Go with my blessing. And Fletcher, bring her around sometime. Alina would love to meet her. Fletcher rode back toward Abiquiu with relief and anticipation warring in his chest. He had no idea what he was doing, no plan beyond spending time with Lillian and seeing where this thing between them led. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Over the next weeks, Fletcher became a regular presence in Abiquiu. He'd ride in most mornings, help Diego in the store or work odd jobs around town to earn his keep, and spend every moment he could with Lillian. They walked together through the snowy streets, talking about everything and nothing. They sat by the fire in the Navarro's living quarters, reading aloud to each other from Lillian's precious books that Margaret had stored for her. They helped Margaret in the store, learning the rhythms of each other's movements until they could work side by side without words. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Abiquiu, nothing went unnoticed for long. Fletcher heard the whispers, the speculation about the cowboy and the merchant's niece, but for once he didn't care what people thought. Let them talk. He'd spent too long hiding from life to worry about gossip now. Lillian bloomed in Abiquiu like a flower finally given proper soil and water. She took to life in the general store naturally, her quick mind perfect for keeping track of inventory and her friendly nature putting customers at ease. Diego and Margaret clearly doted on her, thrilled to have family close again, and she returned their affection with evident joy. But it was the moments alone with Fletcher that Lillian seemed to treasure most. They'd steal away when they could, walking out to the edge of town to watch the sunset, or riding out together on Red to visit the nearby countryside. Fletcher taught her to ride properly, to read the landscape, to understand the rhythms of the territory. Lillian shared her love of books and learning with him, reading poetry that made him think about the world in new ways, telling stories that opened windows into lives and times he'd never known. One evening about 3 weeks after the blizzard, Fletcher worked up the courage to take Lillian to meet Carlos and Alina Rodriguez. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy, wanting desperately for his employers to approve of Lillian, for her to feel comfortable in the world he inhabited when he wasn't in town. The Rodriguez ranch house was large and welcoming, built in the traditional hacienda style around a central courtyard. Alina Rodriguez met them at the door, a small round woman with a smile that could light up a room. She took one look at Lillian and immediately pulled her into a hug. "So you're the one who's brought our Fletcher back to life," Alina said, holding Lillian at arm's length to examine her. "I can see why. Come in, come in. I've made enough food to feed an army." The evening was one of the best Fletcher could remember. Carlos and Alina were warm and welcoming, treating Lillian like family from the first moment. They shared stories about Fletcher, embarrassing ones about his early days on the ranch when he'd been more ghost than man, so traumatized by the war he could barely speak. They talked about the land, the cattle, the challenges and joys of ranch life, and they made it clear without saying it directly that they saw Fletcher as more than just an employee. They cared about him, wanted him to be happy, and they approved wholeheartedly of Lillian. "You'll come back," Alina insisted as they were leaving. "Both of you regularly. I don't see enough young people. And Fletcher, you bring her around the cabin soon, show her your horses. She should see all of your life, not just the parts that fit in town." On the ride back to Abiquiu, Lillian was quiet, and Fletcher worried that perhaps the evening had been too much, that his world was too rough and isolated for someone like her. But when he asked, she shook her head. "I was just thinking how lucky I am," she said. "To have found you, to have found this place. A month ago I was alone in Missouri, surrounded by people but completely isolated. Now I have family and friends and you. It feels like a miracle." "I know what you mean," Fletcher said. "I'd forgotten what this felt like. Connection. Belonging." "You gave that back to me, Lillian." "We gave it to each other," she corrected. March arrived, bringing warmer weather and the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, and green things started to push up through the soil. The territory came alive with color and sound, and Fletcher felt himself coming alive with it. It was on a particularly beautiful evening, with the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple, that Fletcher took Lillian out to a spot he'd found years ago. It was a small valley hidden in the hills, with a spring that created a pool of clear water and cottonwood trees that were just beginning to leaf out. Wild flowers were starting to bloom, splashes of yellow and red against the green. "This is my favorite place in the world," Fletcher said as they dismounted. "I come here when I need to think, when I need to remember why I stayed in this territory." "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Like something from a story. I wanted to bring you here because I needed to talk to you about something important, and I wanted to do it somewhere that mattered." Fletcher took both her hands in his heart pounding. "Lillian, I know it's only been 2 months since you knocked on my door. I know that's not long by most people's standards, but it feels like I've known you forever, like I was just waiting for you to show up and make sense of my life." "Fletcher," Lillian said softly, but he pressed on, needing to get the words out. "I love you. I'm completely, hopelessly in love with you, and I know I don't have much to offer. I'm just a cowboy with a small cabin and some horses, but I work hard and I'm honest, and I would spend every day of my life trying to make you happy if you'd let me. Lillian Nash, would you marry me?" For a moment that felt like eternity, Lillian just stared at him, her eyes wide. Then tears started to spill down her cheeks, and Fletcher's heart sank, certain he'd misread everything, moved too fast, ruined what they had. But then Lillian was laughing through her tears, pulling him close. "Yes, you impossible man. Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you too, Fletcher Crawford. I've loved you since you pulled me into your cabin and saved my life, since you held my hands to warm them, since you looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. Yes, 1,000 times yes." Fletcher kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it, all the love and hope and joy that threatened to overflow. She kissed him back with equal fervor, and they stood there in that hidden valley as the sun set and the stars came out, holding each other like they'd never let go. They returned to town with the news, and if Fletcher had thought the town was interested in their courtship, it was nothing compared to the reaction to their engagement. Margaret cried and insisted on planning everything. Diego broke out a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. Word spread through Abiquiu like wildfire, and suddenly, everyone had opinions about when and where the wedding should be held. "I never thought I'd see Fletcher Crawford settle down," Father Martinez said when he stopped by the store a few days later. The elderly priest had known Fletcher for years, had been one of the few people who tried to draw him out of his isolation. "But I'm glad to be proven wrong. You're good for each other, anyone can see that. When would you like to marry?" Fletcher looked at Lillian, letting her take the lead. They'd talked about this, lying awake late at night in the Navarro's parlor, reluctant to be apart even for sleep. "Soon," Lillian said firmly. "As soon as it can be arranged. We've both waited long enough for happiness. Why delay?" "I can marry you next Sunday if you'd like," Father Martinez offered. "Give people a week to prepare to spread the word." "That would be perfect," Fletcher said, squeezing Lillian's hand. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret threw herself into preparations with the energy of a woman half her age. She worked with the other women in town to prepare food for a celebration, enlisted Diego to arrange for music, and somehow produced a beautiful dress for Lillian from her stock of fabric and her own considerable sewing skills. Elena Rodriguez came into town and immediately appointed herself in charge of making sure Fletcher was properly prepared, which apparently involved new clothes, a haircut, and a long lecture about the responsibilities of marriage that left Fletcher red-faced but smiling. Carlos arranged for several of the other ranchers to attend, wanting Fletcher to have support from his world as well as Lillian's. Men who Fletcher had worked with over the years, who'd become something like friends despite his isolation, made plans to ride in for the celebration. On the morning of the wedding, Fletcher stood in the small church in Abiquiu and wondered if his heart could take much more happiness without bursting. The pews were full of people, the whole town it seemed, plus ranchers and their families from the surrounding countryside. Carlos and Elena sat in the front row with Margaret and Diego, all of them looking proud enough to burst. And then Lillian appeared at the back of the church on Diego's arm, and Fletcher forgot how to breathe. She was radiant in her cream-colored dress, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers, her honey-colored eyes fixed on him with such love it made his knees weak. She walked down the aisle toward him, and Fletcher felt the last walls around his heart finally crumble completely. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Fletcher repeated his vows in a voice that shook with emotion, promising to love and honor and cherish Lillian for all his days. She made the same promises back, her voice clear and strong, and when Father Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed his bride with all the love in his heart while the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed was everything Fletcher hadn't known he wanted. There was food and music and dancing. People he'd kept at arm's length for years came up to clap him on the shoulder and offer congratulations. Children ran through the plaza playing games, old women sat in the shade and gossiped, men gathered to drink and tell stories. But the best part was having Lillian at his side, his wife now, her hand in his as they moved through the crowd. She was radiant, laughing and talking with everyone, already beloved by the community she'd joined. And every time she looked at him, Fletcher saw his own happiness reflected back, multiplied. As evening fell and the party showed no signs of slowing, Fletcher stole Lillian away, and they rode together on Red out to his cabin. Their cabin now. They decided to live there rather than above the store, wanting the privacy and peace of the isolated location, though they'd still help Diego and Margaret regularly. The cabin looked different as they approached, and Fletcher realized Margaret and Elena must have been out here while they were in town. There were curtains in the windows now, wildflowers in a vase on the table, new quilts on the bed. Small touches that made the space feel more like a home and less like a hermit's cave. "They've been busy," Lillian said with a laugh as they stepped inside. "Your employers and my aunt are quite the team." "I think they've adopted us as a joint project," Fletcher agreed. He pulled Lillian into his arms, suddenly serious. "Are you sure about this? Living out here, away from town, away from your family, it's not too late to change your mind to make a different choice." "Fletcher Crawford," Lillian said firmly. "I chose you, I choose you. This cabin, this isolation you're so worried about, it doesn't scare me. You know why? Why? Because you're here. Anywhere you are is home to me now. Besides, we're not truly isolated. We're 3 miles from town, not 300. I can ride in to help at the store, we can have people out to visit. But at the end of the day, we get to come home to this, to each other, to the peace and quiet of our own space. That sounds perfect to me." Fletcher kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and she responded with enthusiasm. They spent their wedding night in that small cabin, the same place where they'd met, where Fletcher had pulled a half-frozen stranger from a blizzard and found his whole world transformed. The months that followed were the happiest of Fletcher's life. He and Lillian fell into rhythms together, learning the dance of married life. She rode with him when he checked the cattle, becoming a skilled horsewoman under his tutelage. He helped her establish a small library of sorts in town, using a corner of the general store to lend books to anyone interested in reading. They made improvements to the cabin together. Fletcher built an addition, creating a separate bedroom and a larger living space. Lillian planted a garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the stubborn soil. They acquired chickens and a milk cow, building toward a more self-sufficient life. But more than the physical changes were the emotional ones. Fletcher found himself opening up to the community in ways he never had before. With Lillian at his side, he felt brave enough to be known, to have friends, to participate in the social fabric of Abiquiu. They attended church on Sundays, went to dances and celebrations, hosted dinners at their cabin for Diego and Margaret and Carlos and Alina. The war and its ghosts still haunted Fletcher sometimes, waking him in the night with memories he'd rather forget. But now, when that happened, Lillian was there to hold him, to remind him that he was a good man despite his past mistakes, that he was loved and worthy of love. Slowly, the nightmares came less frequently. The weight of guilt grew lighter, and Fletcher began to believe he might actually deserve the happiness he'd found. Lillian, too, seemed to grow more vibrant and alive with each passing day. She'd thought she wanted a quiet life helping in her aunt and uncle's store, and she did enjoy that work, but she also discovered a passion for teaching. She started holding informal classes in reading and writing for children in town whose families couldn't afford formal schooling. And she was so good at it that Father Martinez approached her about establishing a proper school. "I never knew I wanted this," she told Fletcher one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "Teaching, I mean. Back in Missouri, it never occurred to me that I could do something like that. But here, in this place, with you supporting me, I feel like I can do anything." "You can," Fletcher said simply. "You're the smartest, most capable person I know, Lillian. Whatever you want to do, you'll succeed at it." By the time their first anniversary approached, their life had settled into something rich and full. They'd faced challenges, certainly. There had been a hard winter where they'd lost some cattle and had to tighten their belts. There had been arguments, as any couple has, learning how to navigate disagreements and differences. But through it all, the foundation of love and respect they'd built remained solid. On a warm spring evening, much like the one when Fletcher had proposed, Lillian told him she was pregnant. Fletcher stared at her for a long moment, letting the news sink in, and then he swept her up in his arms and spun her around until they were both laughing and dizzy. "We're having a baby," he said wonderingly. "I'm going to be a father." "You're going to be an amazing father," Lillian corrected, "and I can't wait to see it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Lillian continued her teaching right up until she became too uncomfortable to stand for long periods. And even then, she held classes sitting down until Margaret and Alina ganged up on her and insisted she rest. Fletcher was simultaneously terrified and thrilled, reading everything he could find about babies and childbirth, pestering the doctor in Abiquiu with questions, driving Lillian crazy with his hovering. "I've never seen you this nervous," Lillian teased one evening, watching him pace their cabin for the 100th time. "You face down angry cattle without flinching, but the thought of a baby has you trembling." "Cattle I understand," Fletcher said. "Babies are a mystery. What if I do it wrong?" "You won't. And even if you make mistakes, which you will because everyone does, you'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." Their son was born on a cold November morning in 1879, 18 months after that blizzard that had brought them together. The labor was long and difficult, and Fletcher aged 10 years in those hours, pacing outside the bedroom while Margaret and the midwife attended to Lillian inside. But when he finally heard his son's first cry, strong and healthy and furious at being born, relief and joy overwhelmed him. Margaret emerged with tears in her eyes. "She's fine, Fletcher. They're both fine. Come meet your son." Fletcher entered the bedroom on shaking legs to find Lillian propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with such love and pride that his eyes filled with tears. "Meet Samuel Thomas Crawford," she said softly, pulling back the blanket so Fletcher could see his son's face. "Samuel for your father, Thomas for mine." Fletcher looked down at the tiny person in Lillian's arms, at the scrunched-up red face and the shock of dark hair, and felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "He's perfect," Fletcher whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. Samuel's fingers immediately wrapped around Fletcher's, gripping with surprising strength, and Fletcher knew in that moment he'd do anything, sacrifice anything, to protect this child and the woman who'd given him life. "You want to hold him?" Lillian asked, and Fletcher nodded, unable to speak. She transferred their son into his arms with practiced ease, though Fletcher held the baby like he was made of glass, terrified of doing something wrong. "You're a natural," Margaret said from the doorway, where she'd been watching with Diego. "Look at you, Fletcher Crawford." Who would have thought that isolated cowboy would turn into such a devoted family man? "I would have," Lillian said firmly. "I knew from the first moment what kind of man he was." Samuel grew strong and healthy, and Fletcher and Lillian's life continued to expand and evolve. The school Lillian had dreamed of became a reality. A small building constructed on the edge of town, with donations from the community, and a lot of volunteer labor. Lillian taught there 3 days a week, bringing Samuel with her when he was small, and the children of Abiquiu flourished under her patient instruction. Fletcher became foreman of the Rodriguez Ranch, a promotion that came with more responsibility and better pay. He hired several of the young men from town to work under him, teaching them as Carlos and Alina had taught him, trying to pass on not just skills but values, honor, a code of living that the territory badly needed. They had more children. A daughter 2 years after Samuel, named Margaret Alina after their grandmothers. Then another son, Diego Carlos, bringing their family to 5. The cabin expanded again to accommodate them, growing from that small one-room structure into a sprawling home full of love and laughter and life. Diego and Margaret grew older but stayed active, doting grandparents who loved to have their great-nieces and great-nephew visit the store. Carlos and Alina were equally devoted, treating Fletcher and Lillian's children like the grandchildren they'd never had, teaching them about the ranch and the land and the heritage of the territory. The years passed in a cascade of moments both monumental and mundane. First steps and first words. Teaching Samuel to ride, watching Margaret learn to read, seeing young Diego's artistic talent emerge. Christmases and birthdays and summer picnics. Hard winters and spring floods and summer droughts. Times of plenty and times of scarcity. Through it all, Fletcher and Lillian remained each other's anchor and North Star. They still stole moments alone when they could, riding out to that hidden valley where Fletcher had proposed, or sitting on their porch after the children were asleep and talking about everything and nothing. The passion between them never dimmed, but it was joined by something deeper, a partnership and friendship that made them stronger together than either could be alone. On their 10th anniversary, Fletcher woke before dawn to find Lillian already awake, watching him in the early light filtering through their bedroom window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. She was 30 now, and if anything more beautiful than the day he'd first seen her, the years adding character and depth to her features. "Just how strange and wonderful life is," Lillian said. 10 years ago, I was traveling alone through a blizzard, terrified I was going to die in the cold. And then I knocked on your door and everything changed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone a different direction, if I'd missed your cabin. Would I have survived? Would I have made it to Abiquiu some other way? Would we have met anyway? "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Fletcher said, pulling her close. "But I'm grateful we don't have to know. I'm grateful you knocked on my door that night. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." "To me too," Lillian said. "You know, sometimes I think about that terrified woman in the storm and she feels like a stranger. I've become so much more than I was then, and it's because of you, because of this life we've built." "We did it together," Fletcher reminded her, a phrase that had become something of a motto for them over the years. As their children grew older, Fletcher and Lillian's life continued to evolve. Samuel showed interest in ranching and began working alongside his father, learning the business from the ground up. Margaret followed in her mother's footsteps, showing such aptitude for teaching that Lillian began training her to take over the school eventually. Diego, true to his namesake, apprenticed with his great-uncle in the store, showing a head for business that delighted the older man. The territory changed around them too. New Mexico inched closer to statehood. Railroads pushed into previously isolated areas. The wild frontier of Fletcher's youth became more settled, more civilized, more connected to the wider world. Not all the changes were positive. There were conflicts with indigenous peoples being pushed onto smaller and smaller reservations. Injustices Fletcher sometimes felt powerless to address, but spoke out against when he could. There was corruption and violence too, the growing pains of a region finding its identity. But through all the changes, Abiquiu remained a close-knit community, and Fletcher and Lillian remained at its heart. They were the people others came to for advice, for help, for wisdom gained through experience. Their home was always open. Their table always had room for one more, and their love provided an example of what was possible when two people committed fully to each other and to building a life together. When Diego Navarro passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Fletcher and Lillian stood with Margaret and the rest of the community to mourn a man who'd been father, friend, and mentor. At the funeral, Margaret pulled Fletcher aside. "Diego loved you like a son," she said, her voice thick with grief but steady. "He told me once that finding Lillian was the best thing that could have happened to you, but you were also the best thing that could have happened to her. He was proud of the life you two built, of the family you raised." "I wanted you to know that." Fletcher had to blink hard against tears. "He was one of the best men I ever knew. I wouldn't be who I am without him and without you, Margaret. You and Diego gave me a place in this community, made me feel like I belonged. I'll never forget that." 3 years later, when Margaret herself grew ill, it was Lillian who nursed her through her final days, holding her hand and reading to her just as Margaret had done for her own mother years before. When Margaret passed, surrounded by love, Lillian grieved deeply, but also felt grateful for all the years they'd had, for all the wisdom and love her aunt had shared. Carlos and Alina Rodriguez lived longer, into their 90s, and when their time came they went together within days of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other. Fletcher organized their funeral, speaking eloquently about what they'd meant to him, how they'd given him a second chance when he desperately needed it, how they'd taught him that family wasn't just blood but choice and love and commitment. As Fletcher and Lillian entered their 50s, they found themselves in the role of elders in their community. Their children were grown and starting families of their own. Samuel married a rancher's daughter and took over more of the day-to-day running of the ranch from Fletcher, who was happy to step back slightly and take on more of an advisory role. Margaret married a teacher from Santa Fe and continued running the school in Abiquiu while raising 3 children of her own. Diego took over the general store, partnering with his wife who brought new ideas and energy to the business. Fletcher and Lillian became grandparents and found that title brought new joys they'd never anticipated. They loved having their grandchildren visit the cabin, teaching them the same lessons they'd taught their own children, telling stories about how they'd met, about the blizzard, and the knock on the door that had changed everything. "Tell us again about how Grandma almost died," one of Samuel's daughters would demand, settling into Fletcher's lap. "Tell us how you saved her." And Fletcher would tell the story, with Lillian adding details and corrections, and their grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, unable to imagine a time when their grandparents weren't together, weren't the solid, unshakable foundation of their family. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. 3 children, their spouses, and 7 grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard, along with friends from town and the ranch. There was food and music and laughter, stories told and memories shared. And when Fletcher looked around at everything he and Lillian had built together, he felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. That night, after everyone had left and they were alone again in their bedroom, Lillian came to stand beside Fletcher at the window. Outside, the moon illuminated the landscape they both loved, the high desert beautiful and stark and full of life if you knew where to look for it. 25 years, Lillian said softly. A quarter-century since I knocked on your door in a blizzard. Best knock I ever answered, Fletcher replied, putting his arm around her waist and pulling her close. I was thinking about something today, watching our family, Lillian continued. About legacy and what we leave behind. And I realized that our greatest achievement isn't any single thing we've done. It's all of it together. The children we raised, the community we've been part of, the love we've shared, that's what matters. That's what will endure. We did good, didn't we? Fletcher said, seeking confirmation. We did so good, Lillian assured him. We took the worst night of our lives and turned it into the beginning of the best lives we could have imagined. We built something real and lasting, Fletcher, something that matters. They stood there together, watching the moon rise higher, and Fletcher thought about that terrified cowboy who'd opened his door 5 years ago, so isolated and lonely and lost. That man barely existed anymore, transformed by love and family and purpose into someone who knew his own worth, who understood that his past mistakes didn't define his future, who'd learned that letting people in was the bravest thing he could do. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both welcome and difficult. Fletcher's hair went completely gray, then white. His body, battered by decades of hard work, began to slow down. Lillian, too, showed the signs of age, but Fletcher thought she'd never been more beautiful, her face lined with the marks of laughter and love, her eyes still that same honey color that could stop his heart. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th. They welcomed more grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. They buried friends and made new ones. They weathered droughts and floods, good years and bad, always together, always partners. When New Mexico finally achieved statehood in 1912, Fletcher and Lillian celebrated with their family and community. marveling at how much the territory had changed since they'd first met. The wild frontier was gone, replaced by something more settled and civilized, but the bones of that original place remained, the harsh beauty and the sense of possibility that had drawn them both here. As they moved into their 60s and then their 70s, Fletcher and Lillian made peace with aging. They still lived in their beloved cabin, though it had been modified over the years to make it easier for them to manage. Their children and grandchildren were nearby, providing help when needed but respecting their fierce independence. They still rode together when the weather was good, though at a more sedate pace than in their youth. They still rode together by the fire on cold nights. They still held hands, still kissed goodbye when one of them left the house, still said, "I love you," every single day. The passion had mellowed into something deeper and more abiding, but it had never disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger with each year that passed. On a warm evening in the summer of 1918, 40 years after that fateful blizzard, Fletcher and Lillian sat on their porch watching another spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were both 80 now, and while their bodies had slowed, their minds remained sharp and their love as strong as ever. "You ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Lillian asked, a familiar question between them, one they revisited every so often. "Every day," Fletcher admitted. "And every day I'm grateful things happened exactly the way they did. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Lillian Crawford. These 40 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life." "Only 40 years," Lillian teased. "What about the first 26 before you met me?" "Those were just preparation," Fletcher said seriously. "Everything before you was just getting me to the place where I could appreciate what we have. The good and the bad, the joy and the pain, all of it led me to that moment when you knocked on my door. And I'd do it all again, every hard day, every mistake, every loss if it meant ending up here with you." Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Around them, the land they'd made their own hummed with life. In town, their family went about their evening routines. In the cabin behind them, a fire crackled in the hearth they'd sat beside thousands of times. "We built a good life," Lillian said eventually. "Against all odds, despite everything that could have gone wrong, we built something beautiful and lasting. I hope you're proud of that, Fletcher. I hope you know how much it all meant." "I am proud," Fletcher said. "Of you, of us, of everything we created together. And I know exactly how much it meant, because every single day with you has been precious to me. Every moment, from that first night in the blizzard to right now, has been a gift I never thought I'd get to have." They sat there until the stars filled the sky and the moon rose full and bright over the landscape they loved. Then, hand in hand, Fletcher and Lillian Crawford went inside their home, the home they'd built together over 4 decades, and closed the door on another perfect day in a life full of them. The knock on the door during the blizzard, the cowboy who'd answered and found his future wife, that was just the beginning. The real story was everything that came after, the love that grew and deepened with each passing year, the family they raised and the community they served. The quiet moments and the grand celebrations, the ordinary days that added up to an extraordinary life. It was a story that would be told and retold by their descendants for generations to come. The story of how Fletcher Crawford opened his door in a storm and found salvation, how Lillian Nash knocked on that door seeking shelter and found home. The story of 2 people who chose each other and kept choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives, building something lasting in a harsh and unforgiving land, proving that love, real love, could not just survive but thrive if tended with care and commitment and unwavering devotion. And at the end of their long and happy lives, when Fletcher passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84 with Lillian's hand in his, and when Lillian followed him just months later as if she couldn't bear to be without him, their family gathered to celebrate 2 lives well lived and a love story for the ages. They were buried together in the Abiquiu Cemetery under a simple stone that read, "Fletcher Crawford and Lillian Crawford, beloved parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and friends, together forever." 1848-1932 and 1850-1932, but their real legacy wasn't in stone. It was in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they'd raised, who carried forward their values of hard work and honor and love. It was in the community of Abiquiu, forever changed by their presence and their contributions. It was in the cabin they'd shared for so many years, still standing strong, still sheltering family when storms rolled through. And it was in the story itself, told on cold winter nights when the wind howled and snow fell. The story of the knock on the door during a blizzard, the cowboy who answered, and the wife he found. The story of how the worst night of their lives became the first night of their happily ever after, proving that sometimes the most unexpected moments can lead to the most extraordinary love, if you're brave enough to open the door and let someone in.